Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sharon Schwartz. We're looking at a passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So in the previous lesson, we examined how Paul encouraged the believers at Corinth to not exercise their Christian freedoms, in that case, eating meat offered to idols, if it would cause this weaker, less mature believer to stumble in their faith. In chapter 9, Paul begins to address a criticism of his own ministry while using the occasion to demonstrate how he himself is applying this same principle he discussed in chapter 8, how he is not allowing himself to be a stumbling block. So just as he is encouraging them not to eat meat that has been offered to idols, if it might create an offense, he has also chosen to forego receiving financial compensation from the Corinthian church so that he might not create an obstacle to his main objective of bringing people to Christ. So he had chosen, in this case, not to request financial compensation from this particular church. Now let's understand what's going on. Paul's choice might appear to be noble in the modern era. In the days of Paul, manual labor was generally regarded as work that was not appropriate for someone who was a free Roman citizen. But there's more to the issue than just going against the status quo of class here. The book of Acts, chapter 18, verse 3, indicates that Paul supported himself by making tents. When he came to Corinth, he chose to support himself through his own manual labor. This broke the social convention of patronage that was the norm during that day. In a patronage system, when wealthy people would provide financially for others, it would place the recipients under an obligation to the wealthy provider. By supporting himself, Paul was refusing to come under the obligation and influence of the wealthy people in the city. In other words, he would not give them any leverage over his ministry. This was taken as a slight against the Corinthian church and was a source of contention. So, to make the insult even worse, Paul had told the Corinthians he was prepared to receive assistance from the Macedonians in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9. In the social convention of that day, this would imply that the Macedonians would have influence with Paul that the Corinthians would not have. And it's clear in verses 7 through 12 that Paul understood he had a biblical right to request compensation. When we read these verses, we would more likely assume that he was defending some compensation he had received. But instead, he's laying out a case that proves his right to financial compensation and then explaining why he is refusing that same Christian liberty. Because Paul made the gospel his main priority, it affected the way he applied biblical theology in his financial decisions. So bringing people to Christ meant more to Paul than easy money. So being supported by wealthy people was not only expected, it was much easier and more lucrative than tent making. Bringing people to Christ was more important than being than the socially acceptable thing. Paul was willing to break social convention and even socially offend wealthy believers for the sake of preaching the gospel. When non-believers heard Paul preach in Corinth and became aware that he was not being financially compensated by the wealthy, it increased Paul's integrity and the authenticity of his message. The glory of Christ and the gospel was simply more important to Paul. So, Sharon, has there ever been something you had scriptural permission to do, but felt like it was better for you not to do it?
This was hard
Mm-hmm.
to think of something. There was a lot of things I could say that Scripture was silent about, and I didn't do. But the money thing, I'll use that. When we were missionaries, I had an opportunity for 2 months. One of the local churches wanted me to head up a outdoor. It was like a VBS. Every Saturday we met. They have parks, and we advertised and went around. And they wanted to pay me to do that, and I was being sponsored, whatever, by our local church. they didn't do a salary type thing. They did a little different thing. Anyway, I didn't feel comfortable. I said no. Well, they were so concerned because they knew the work I was putting in it. They actually wrote the elders back here to the States and said, "Can she take the money?" And they said, "Well, of course she can." But I still wouldn't. And I've still got people I talk to in that church or write, not often, but I get a Christmas card because they just thought that was very kind. But to me, it didn't cost me anything.
Right.
I don't know if, so that's the only thing there's a lot of things Scripture's silent about that I feel like I could do that I don't.
Right. The things that it's silent about, I think, tend to become
a little more
complicated.
Yeah.
Because you can have different opinions.
Right.
Some of those questions are things like, what is modest? Right.
That varies.
Yeah. That word modest, when I ask this person and when I ask another person, can look completely different. Some of it's based on age, some of it's based on background, some of it's based on viewpoint,
And who you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah, you have a different perspective depending on the situation you're coming out from. I grew up where there were things like my mom didn't wear pants until the last 20 years. She's never cut her hair since she got saved. And she would be quick to tell you, I don't believe the Bible forbade it, but it was my personal conviction, right? And that's how I describe things that are personal convictions that either I can or can't do. And they have evolved over the years, right? There are some things now that I would have done when I was younger that I wouldn't dare do now. And there may be some things that I wouldn't have done when I was younger that I would do now because I understand that I can see the whatever
bigger picture.
Yeah, I think yesterday you talked about going to the movies. I know some people who are very conservative in their views of like what they watch. They want. When I was growing up, when I was younger, so you and I are old enough to. And you're a little older than I am, so you would have even a different memory. I remember when we first got cable TV, right? But I remember when the movies went, the only way you could watch like newer movies was at the movies. And then all of a sudden, HBO comes along. HBO was the first one to make those inroads where they're getting newer movies, uncut, no ads, and things that you could have only seen if you went to the movie theater. Well, then, you're no longer, the question then is no longer, is somebody going to see you, right, at the movie theater, because you have the access to it. And frankly, the stuff that is available at my house through Netflix and Amazon are worse than anything I would go sit down and pay for at the movies.
Right.
Right. And so there becomes this dilemma. I have questions about how you should use money, in the church, on the church side. That is something that has always been very particular to me. I am going to try to outgive everybody. Now, that's a struggle sometimes, but I'm going to try because I never want to be in a position where somebody has a leg up on me that can leverage me in the church. So I'll break my neck to try to outgive somebody. And obviously I have more access to that.
Right.
And no, but and I've been asked by pastors and missionaries, how do you deal with somebody who has money? What do you do? Are you afraid they're going to? No, I'm not afraid they're going to leave the church. They can go.
Right.
Right. If that's the card they're going to play.
They're not lobbyists.
No.
And that's, a lot of people think that. Right. I mean,
and that's what I read Paul doing there. He don't want them to have a way to twist his arm, and he's like, no, I'm not going to put myself in that position.
not long ago, a church I know, a family donated well, it's probably been 10, 12 years ago, a phone tree, the machine or whatever. I don't know enough about it. And then the very next church decision that was made, he walked in, the husband walked into the elders and said, I don't want us to vote on this because I donated that. I want to be able to make the decision. And it had nothing to do with the phone tree. It had to do with really hiring a youth pastor. And they let him. I was like, I'd have taken that phone tree machine.
Right, yeah. He would have suddenly had a phone tree to call his family on.
Yeah, he would have.
I can tell you that's how
well,
it would
probably after, he probably would have walked to the car a little funny with it, but that's exactly,
Yeah.
I would have ripped it right out of the wall and said,
And we would be
buddy.
surprised in the American church how much leverage people apply with money.
Yes.
Fortunately, I don't see it here. It would be very unwelcome. I can't imagine somebody
doing that.
They know better, right? I can't imagine. But I know pastors who fear for their jobs if a particular person leaves, or they have so much control. I mean, I know some churches about our size, which is still fairly large. The reason why he's talking about money here is if you allow people to control you with money, like I don't even like people to buy me a meal for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
I don't ever want you to think you got leverage when it comes to hiring somebody or building a building or a program, because, there has been a time in the church where people, if they would give money and put on the envelope 4X. And what they meant was, I'm buying this and your church I'm going to make the donation. No, you can't do that.
Right.
Like you, one, that's illegal, by the way. Two, you can't dictate to people.
Right.
And it's a really, really dangerous precedent. And it happens in church more often than we like. And I think Paul, that's one of the things I like about this chapter is Paul's telling them, I'm not working because I have to.
Right.
I'm working to keep you from having leverage on me. Can you think of some examples when it would be more beneficial for the sake of bringing people to Jesus to go against what is socially accepted in our culture?
Yeah, I've got a great example of this. Several years ago, 3 or 4, maybe, I don't know, again, my time. May school, we homeschool our grandkids, so it's been since COVID. We took the kids up to the Amish country. I'd never been, they had never been, and we went up there and stayed at an Airbnb. And the owners of that Airbnb were Amish. And they had an elderly friend who calls all of their guests and invites them to dinner if they'd like to come. And so I got a call. This elderly Amish woman invited us to dinner. And we accepted. And it's, if you want to give her a gift to pay for the food, you can anyway, but it's a dinner. But we had done our homework, before we went up, and the kids and all of us had learned some cultural things, and they don't allow telephones in their homes. So we left all of our phones in the car, even the teenagers, which, was, so anyway, when we got into the house and we were sitting around the table, and she sat down and said, okay, we can start. Well, we did what we did, hold hands, prayed for the food, went on. And so finally one of the kids, she was mixing some potatoes and using a drill anyway about electricity. It got to phones. And one of the kids said, how did you call May if you don't have a phone? And she said they're not allowed in the house, that her son was a farmer. And he didn't even have it in his office. There's a shed that the phone's in. So she needs to use the phone. She goes to that shed. So when we were leaving, she stopped me after everybody had left and said, I want to tell you something. Apparently I had said something in the conversation that made her think, they must be Christians, I wonder. And then when she saw us pray, she thought, well, that's a little bit of a, maybe they are. But when we talked about the phone, she said, do you all have phones? And Rayleigh, my youngest grandson, said, yeah, we left them in the car out of respect for you. She said, I'm so touched. That shows me you truly love Jesus. Now, there was absolutely nothing wrong with me taking that phone in, but us not taking the phone in and showing her respect, it would have been wrong taking the phone in because it would have left an impression on her that what I said and what I did is two different things.
That's an interesting thing, that they have a phone. They just have it in a different place.
And it's charged by solar. They have electricity.
I'll tell you, they have electricity from solar.
Solar. Batteries. Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you something funny. I met a guy a couple years ago. He owns the largest outdoor furniture manufacturing business in the country. He's a Mennonite. And as my friend John says, Mennonites are just backslid Amish people.
Yes.
But he employs a lot of Amish. And I said, so they can use electricity? He said, they can in the factory. He said, they come, they work for us, they work with the electricity, they go back, they don't have it at their house. He said, he said, they can't have phones, but we can provide them a business phone so we can contact them about work, and they're allowed to have it. So like there's, always workarounds. And I think that's one of the questions that I think happen from time to time. Is I grew up when I was younger, and the question was, is it right or is it wrong? That was the only thing I wanted to know, because we wanted to get as close to the line without going to hell as we possibly could.
You want to feel the heat, but
we wanted to smell smoky, but we didn't we didn't want to get burnt. The thing that I've learned as I've gotten older is that that's not the goal. The goal is to try to have a relationship with Christ and to look like him as much as possibly can. And we don't find anywhere Jesus going, let me see if I can get away with this. Right. Let me see how far I can go without somebody saying something. Right. That's not that. He stayed as far away from it as possibly could. And I think us as believers can afford to do that.
I agree.
More often. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of 1 Corinthians.